I want to welcome you to Young, Gifted, and Wild About Birds. I'm Joyce Lights. I'm Executive Director of Connecticut Audubon Society. And before I invite Fengyi Guo to introduce herself, I just wanted to take a moment to thank you. As a member and supporter, you make it possible for us to continue to advance environmental protections for birds and wildlife. I have the honor of amplifying your voice to our legislators, but yesterday I was truly inspired by the number of our members who reached out to your legislators, submitted testimony, or actually came to the Capitol and took the time to introduce yourself to me, all to support our environmental protections for birds and wildlife. You are so awesome and you inspire us. As migration increases through our state, our expert staff continue to manage more than 3,400 acres of habitat for breeding and migratory birds. This work directly relates to Guo's, I'm sorry, mispronounced my last name, Freda, presentation tonight on stopover ecology and conservation of migratory land birds in eastern US. Habitat loss is one of the major reasons for our loss of birds that we're hearing about. In addition to pesticides and other issues, losing habitat has been a big impact on migratory birds. With as many as 1 million birds migrating over Connecticut each night during peak migration, stopover conservation is extremely important. Habitat loss is one of those declines in our populations. And your commitment to ensuring Connecticut remains a vital part of the Atlantic Flyway guides in all the work that we do at Connecticut Audubon. Now I'd like to invite Freda to introduce herself. Freda was so looking forward to your presentation.
Thanks, Joyce, for the really kind introduction. And good evening, everyone. It's my great pleasure to be here and share my research with you all. So my name is Fengyi Guo. I also go by Freda. I'm a conservation biologist and migration ecologist focusing on solutions-oriented research. Currently, I am a postdoctoral fellow at Cornell University and Cornell Lab of Ornithology, working on some bird migration and conservation. And the work I'm going to talk about today are mostly from my PhD dissertation at Princeton University. But if there's time in the Q&A, I'd also be happy to chat a bit about my ongoing project at Cornell. So let's get started. Can you all see my screen?
We can.
Great. Okay. So yes, I will talk about bird migration and conservation, but I'd like to start by introducing the migration journey of myself. I grew up in a small town in central China, and I went to the University of Hong Kong for my undergraduate and master's study, where I was first introduced to the field of ecology. I then came to the US for my PhD study at Princeton, starting my long-distance trans-Pacific migration. And because there's no direct flight from Princeton back to my hometown, I still go through Hong Kong every time I go back home. Therefore, Hong Kong is an important stopover site for me, especially after a 16-hour nonstop flight. And not surprisingly, since I moved to Ithaca last year for my postdoc here at Cornell, the Princeton, New York area has become another one of my stopover sites. And birds need stopover sites too, which is what I study in terms of bird migration. In this presentation, I will first talk about two projects on identifying and characterizing stopover hotspots of migratory land birds in the eastern United States, followed by a third project on how land birds negotiate migration barriers. So we all have heard of the loss of 3 billion birds in North America over the past 5 decades, and among them, 2.5 billion of the population decline are in migratory species, especially for land birds such as warblers, sparrows, and thrushes, as shown in this pie chart on the right. And conservation of migratory birds requires a full annual cycle perspective because the population limiting factor can occur at any stage of the entire migration cycle. However, most research and conservation efforts have been focusing on the breeding and wintering ground, whereas the en route migration period remains less studied. despite it also being the period with the highest adult mortality in the annual cycle of migrants. And there is a saying that a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. The migration period is probably the weakest link that has been so understudied. And that's why I got interested in this, to fill in the gaps of the full annual cycle conservation of migratory birds. Stopover sites are the most critical habitats during migration. These are the sites that birds use to rest and refuel during their long-distance migration journey. Nevertheless, most of the studies on the importance of stopover sites are about waterfowl and shorebirds. We still know very little about the stopover sites for migratory land birds. And the challenges of studying the stopover ecology of migratory land birds lie in their unique migration patterns. Waterfowls and shorebirds tend to concentrate in small areas during stopover, making them easier to observe. However, land birds are thought to migrate in a broad front and can be found almost anywhere. Their small body size also made it hard to detect where they concentrate during migration. And you can probably tell the difference between snow geese birding and warbler birding in these two pictures. So figuring out the important stopover sites for effective conservation of migratory land birds thus requires a continental scale monitoring of bird migration at the population level, which is beyond the capacity of typical field surveys and radio telemetry. We need some novel methods with unprecedented spatial temporal coverage to address this problem. And radar is the answer. This map shows the coverage area of over 100 weather radars in the contiguous United States. Each one of them actively samples the atmosphere every 4 to 10 minutes, making it an ideal tool for bird migration monitoring. So how does radar monitor bird migration? Well, it is the same as in weather monitoring. All radar stations actively send out radio reflective signals to the surrounding atmosphere, which hit the object in the air and gets reflected back to the radar station. And then, so the radar station can then detect the size and movements of the object in the air based on the reflected signals received. Meteorologists typically remove biological contamination before generating the weather forecast that we use every day, and we ecologists do the opposite. We take the raw data, remove precipitation, and the rest are predominantly biological activities or birds. And I will explain in more details about how we map stopover density or birds on the ground later in this presentation. And here are just some example patterns of different objects on radar images. For bird migration research, the common sources of contamination are non-biological signals like precipitation and biological signals like insects and bats, which can be excluded based on their distinct radar patterns and flying speed, which are also detected by radar. So with this powerful tool of radar remote sensing, the first question we need to address is whether stopover hotspots exist for land birds, because they don't seem to aggregate as waterfowls and shorebirds do, at least not detected by typical field surveys. And if there are indeed hotspots, we need to figure out where they are. So before we start looking for those hotspots, it is important to first define them. They should support high density of migrants, and they also need to be consistent across years. This is because we often have very limited conservation resources, and the loss of habitats that receive heavy and consistent bird use across years is more likely to directly affect the population abundance. For this study, we examined 60 radar stations in the eastern United States, which is the region experiencing the greatest population decline of migratory birds, colored in red on the right. And this figure shows the zoom-in details of more than 200,000 pixels within each radar domain. And these pixels are the smallest units of hotspot map that I will show you later in this presentation. Because radar operates on a polar grid, the size of the pixel also varies from 0.4 to 22 hectares, depending on how far away they are from the radar center. So how do we map bird stopover density using weather radar? Well, we know that most land birds migrate at night. They usually lift off shortly after sunset to start their migration journey and continue to fly until close to sunrise, where they settle at the stopover sites before taking off again. So the key to this process is this special moment of synchronized takeoff of migrants near sunset, which can be well captured by weather radars. And by sampling the nightly takeoff of birds, we can infer their daily stopover distribution based on where they took off at night. So this animation shows the takeoff of birds within a radar domain in Louisiana, with warmer colors showing higher density of birds. So you see that birds were concentrated at the shoreline at the beginning of the takeoff and gradually got dispersed in the atmosphere as time goes on. So to obtain the most accurate estimation of underground stopover density, timing is crucial. We don't want to sample it too early to miss the majority of migration, but we also don't want to sample it too late, otherwise birds are no longer where they took off from. That's why we apply this dynamic sampling approach by plotting the aggregated reflectivity or bird density across each radar domain over time within 3 hours near sunset. You can see that the reflectivity is low at the beginning of the evening and starts to increase as birds begin to take off. At some point, it hits the inflection point with maximum increase in reflectivity representing peak takeoff of migrants. Later in the evening, birds are widely dispersed in the atmosphere. We chose this inflection point as the sampling point to maximize the number of birds sampled while minimizing dispersion. This then generates the map of stopover density for this radar on this night. And by stacking the nightly stopover density for all available migration nights throughout the season, we can calculate the seasonal cumulative stopover density. And we repeat the same procedure for 5 autumn migration seasons from 2015 to 2019 to assess interannual consistency for hotspot identification. This covers 60 radar stations in 5 autumn migration seasons, consisting of 500,000 radar scans. Let's see what we found. So this animation shows the aggregated stopover density of birds across each radar domain, with warmer colors showing higher stopover density. The year marker is in the upper left corner. So you see that most of the radar domains are yellow to orange in color, representing similar stopover densities. This shows that at the core scale, the distribution of birds is pretty even across the eastern United States, confirming the conventional wisdom that land birds migrate across a broad front. On the other hand, there are also a few sites with relatively higher densities across years. Those tend to be near the Appalachian Mountain in the east and along the Mississippi River in the west. Apart from the broad front pattern at the core scale, we do see considerable variation in stopover density at the finer pixel scale. In this map, I'm plotting the average stopover density across all 5 years for the nearly 9 million radar pixels. Note the scale change in color for density compared to the core scale result. So you can probably tell that there are some hotspots and hot stripes emerging, such as in the zooming panel at the convergence of the Mississippi and the Ohio rivers. But remember, the most important stopover sites are those that consistently support high density of migrants every year. So now let's take a look at the yearly map of stopover density, and you can focus on any patch of high density areas that look interesting to you and see if that changes by year. Ready? This is 2015, 2016, 2017, 2018, and 2019. So you can probably tell that there are some interannual variations, but there are also high density patches that are pretty consistent across years. That's how we classify hotspots, based on both the density and interannual consistency. Specifically, we use the top 10 percentile density threshold to identify pixels that are supporting the highest density of birds each season. And by stacking 5 years of data, we can then count the number of years that a pixel is within the top 10 percentile. Those supporting the highest density of birds in all 5 years are identified as hotspots, as shown by the dark blue color in this map. So now the hotspots are more obvious to see. And in the same zooming panel, we see large clusters of hotspots at the convergence of the two major rivers. Among all 9 million radar pixels, 2.3% of them are identified as hotspots in this way, covering an area of 1.5 million hectares. So what are the important habitats of these hotspots identified? To answer that question, we overlaid satellite images of different land cover types onto the hotspot map to identify the most important habitat for migratory land birds. And the results are quite intuitive. In general, we found that hotspot probability increases with all types of forest cover, including deciduous forest, evergreen forest, mixed forest, as well as woody wetland. An example curve of hotspot probability increasing with local deciduous forest cover is shown on the left. In contrast, hotspot probability decreases with agricultural land cover, such as in the case of cultivated crops shown on the right. What about the landscape with both forest and agricultural land? Here we have the satellite images of Des Moines in Iowa, and hopefully you can see that most of the landscape, most of the region is agricultural land, with just a few remaining strips of forest here and there. If not, I have highlighted those forest fragments in green, surrounded by cropland in yellow for your easier reference. And guess what? These forest fragments are exactly where the birds concentrate during stopover, as shown by the dark blue color in the hotspot map. In other words, birds are funneled into the deciduous forest fragments located within broadly deforested regions. A similar example at a smaller scale would be Central Park in New York City, with essentially the same principle. The birds have nowhere else to go other than to make use of the remaining forest fragments. And this result is particularly important to conservation because these forest fragments are traditionally thought to be of almost no value to the breeding birds, as birds' nesting success is so low in fragmented habitats like this. However, they might be the only available habitat for the same bird population during migration, which should not be ignored in conservation planning. After all, no matter how many birds survive at the breeding ground, birds will still die if there's not enough stopover sites on the way. So that's all about autumn migration. What about spring migration? And how well protected are the identified hotspots? I know you have all these questions in mind, and these are naturally our next study questions. Using the same radar-based approach as explained before, here we identify stopover hotspots separately for spring and autumn, with additional data from the Gulf of Mexico. Within each season, hotspots are identified as the pixels that are within the top 10 percentile density for all 5 sampled years. So we see some interesting seasonal differences in hotspot distributions. For instance, there are more hotspots in the western part of the study area during spring migration, particularly in the Midwest, whereas there tends to be an eastward shift in hotspot distribution for autumn migration. And this seasonal shift is likely driven by changes in atmospheric conditions and vegetation productivity. We also found a stronger preference towards deciduous forest during spring migration, likely due to the more abundant food supply, such as caterpillars in deciduous trees. In contrast, during autumn migration, many birds shift their diets to a broader range of food items, including fruits, which probably leads to the wider range of habitat they can use during fall migration. For easier comparisons, here we plot the combined map of stopover hotspots in at least one season, covering an area of 2.4 million hectares. So the green shows hotspots only in spring, but not in autumn. Brown shows hotspots only in autumn, but not in spring. And purple shows two-season hotspots in both spring and autumn. So you can probably tell that spring hotspots are not the same as autumn hotspots, as you don't see much purple in this map. In fact, there is only about 17% spatial overlap between the seasons. So how many of these hotspots are actually protected? To answer that question, we overlaid the existing protected area in the United States onto the hotspot map. You can see from this map that most of the protected areas are in the western part of the country, whereas the eastern United States is much less protected. So how does that apply to the hotspots we identified? In this map, I only colored the protection level of the identified hotspots. So all the non-hotspot pixels, which are like 98% of them, are colored as gray, regardless of whether they are protected or not. And here, the dark green color shows hotspots under high protection status, such as nature reserves and national parks. The light green color shows hotspots with low protection status that are subject to extractive uses, such as state forest, whereas yellow highlights hotspots that are not protected at all. Hopefully you can see that yellow dominates the map, meaning that most hotspots are not protected. In fact, only about 1/3 of all identified hotspots are within protected areas. And of those, more than half are under low protection status, subject to extractive uses. So what about Connecticut? I'm sure many of you would like to zoom in and see where the hotspots are in the state of Connecticut. And thanks to Tom, I found this map showing the locations of Connecticut Audubon Center and sanctuaries, and many of them are actually within the radar coverage areas. So I plotted those Connecticut Audubon sanctuaries as purple dots on the space map and overlaid the stopover density maps on top of it. So here we have the 5-year average stopover density for spring migration with darker color showing higher stopover density. So you might notice that the color appears to be darker than the national maps that I showed earlier. And this is because I have adjusted the color scale to highlight the density comparisons within this region. And the first thing come to your mind is probably the big spatial gap in the state of Connecticut that are not covered by radar. And this is because, unfortunately, there's no weather radar within the state itself. However, we still get a pretty good coverage from the 2 nearby radars in New York City and Boston, which provides valuable information about migrant distribution during stopover. For instance, we can see that the overall stopover density is higher in southern Connecticut than in Long Island, which is probably not too surprising given the intensive land use history in Long Island. We can also see that some sanctuaries, Connecticut Audubon sanctuaries are indeed located in areas with high stopover densities of migratory land birds, such as those in southwestern Connecticut. And I'd be very curious to hear about the birds you've seen during migration in those locations. The spatial pattern is also similar during fall migration, which happens after birds reproduce in the breeding season. And that's why we see this overall increase in stopover density due to the addition of juveniles. And there are also some interesting seasonal differences. For instance, the areas south of Hartford seem to be used more by migrants in fall than in spring. So again, I'm very curious to know more about the bird community and vegetation features there. Let's have a look at the protected area coverage. Here, the light green color shows areas under low protection status, such as state forest, and dark green color shows areas under high protection status, like nature reserves. In general, we see that there are quite a few protected areas in Connecticut, and many of them overlap with areas of high stopover, high bird density, which is a good sign. But still, not all high-density areas are protected, which could be the target of future conservation efforts. To conclude the first two projects, we found that at the core scale, land birds migrate across a broad front. This suggests that conservation should not focus only on a few states. Instead, we need a well-distributed network of widespread, locally based conservation efforts. At finer scales, we identify stopover hotspots that consistently support high density of migrants every year, although spring hotspots are not the same as autumn hotspots. This highlights the necessity to protect identified hotspots in each season. We also highlight the importance of forest fragments as stopover sites to migratory birds. These fragments were traditionally thought to be worthless to the breeding birds, but their value during migration should not be ignored. Finally, most hotspots are not protected, highlighting a major conservation gap, especially on working lands that are often privately owned. To address this gap, we are working closely with the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service on the Working Lands for Wildlife program, which is an incentive-based conservation program for focusing on habitat protection and restoration on private lands. Specifically, we help to identify priority areas for the Eastern Deciduous Forest Conservation Framework currently under development to protect those stopover sites. So this will be the first time that stopover sites for migratory land birds are incorporated into national level conservation planning. All these results underscores the importance of stopover sites to migratory land birds. What happens if there's not enough stopover sites? This brings us to our third project on the impacts of large-scale land use change on birds' migratory behaviors. The eastern United States could be divided into 3 avifauna biomes based on shared breeding bird community and habitat similarity. Here we have the northern forest in blue, eastern forest in green, and prairie land in yellow. And despite being part of the prairie land, the Midwestern United States is now dominated by agricultural land use, mostly corn and soybean field. Therefore, it is also known as the Corn Belt. We reconstructed the land use history of the Midwest Corn Belt over the past 4 centuries using a recently published dataset integrating historical census data and land cover models. As you can see, the Midwest was historically covered by 2/3 of forest and 1/3 of grassland. Since the 1980s, rapid cropland and pasture expansion has replaced most of the native vegetation, leaving only a small proportion of forest and grassland available in the Corn Belt. So how would such large-scale agricultural expansion affect land birds migrating through this region? As a natural comparison, we know that birds do adjust their behaviors when negotiating inhospitable landscapes, lack of stopover site, such as the Sahara Desert and the Gulf of Mexico, which may now have a different name, but let's stick with this one. These are known as migration barriers. To cross these barriers, birds sometimes need to fly nonstop for extended periods. For instance, Trans-Gulf migrants need to fly over 15 hours to cross the more than 1,000 kilometers of open water before reaching the first available habitat on the Gulf Coast. Tracking studies also reveal that birds tend to fly faster and select for better tailwind support to efficiently cross the barrier in a shorter time. Do we see the same behavior changes for birds crossing the Corn Belt? Luckily, weather radar also enables us to compare the flight behaviors of birds above each radar domain. In this figure, each dot shows the average flight speed of birds flying above one radar domain, with purple showing radars in the northern forest, yellow showing radars in the Corn Belt, and green showing radars in the eastern forest. And within each plot, the groups not sharing any letters like the A, B, and C's are significantly different from each other. For example, we see that birds do fly at faster speeds above the Corn Belt than the eastern forest in both spring and autumn because the letters are different. However, they also appear to have faster speeds when flying above the northern forest, although there are only 3 radar stations there, which makes it less representative, but still shows that other factors might also affect birds' flying speed. We also found greater selection for tailwind of birds crossing the Corn Belt than the eastern forest biome in both seasons. And this selection index is calculated as the difference between experienced and available wind speed. If you are interested, I'd be happy to go into more details about how this metric is calculated in the Q&A. So the Corn Belt is indeed an anthropogenic migration barrier affecting birds' flight behaviors. How is that compared to the Gulf of Mexico? If we put these 2 barriers side by side, you'll notice that most part of the Corn Belt is still narrower than the open water in the Gulf because the scale of the Corn Belt is almost half of that the Gulf map. Furthermore, there are still forest fragments within the Corn Belt that birds could use as stopover sites, as we discussed before. Whereas in the case of the Gulf, there is barely any stopover sites available. And finally, the Corn Belt might only be a barrier for forest species, but not for grassland species, while the Gulf of Mexico affects all bird species migrating through the region. Therefore, we expect the Corn Belt to be a weaker barrier compared to the Gulf. How can we test for that? Ideally, we'd like to have some radar stations located within the Gulf to make such direct comparisons, which is not so realistic. However, we can still compare the impacts based on birds' behavior after crossing the barriers. So we calculated a metric called the stopover to passage ratio to compare such barrier impacts. Here, we only included 47 radar stations within the longitudinal range of the Corn Belt to directly assess the impacts on birds confronting both barriers. I have already shown you the stopover density map, which represents the number of birds stopping over in each radar domain. And this is calculated by summing the total number of birds lifting off near sunset of each migration night. We can also calculate the number of birds passing through each radar domain, and this is done by integrating all bird passage detected by radar from sunset until sunrise for each migration night throughout the season. If we divide the number of birds stopping over by the number of birds flying by, we get this value of stopover to passage ratio, which measures the proportion of birds stopping in each radar domain, with higher value representing greater population-wise propensities to stop over during migration. And the darker the color, the higher the SPR. So if we compare the SPR following the direction of bird movements in spring, as denoted by the arrow, we see some interesting patterns along the Gulf Coast. For spring migration, birds arrive at the northern Gulf Coast after the prolonged trans-Gulf migration, and many of them would be too exhausted that they must stop to rest and refuel right by the coast after a 24-hour, 36-hour nonstop flight. Therefore, we see these high values of stopover to passage ratios near the Gulf Coast, which then decreases substantially as birds move further inland with more stopover opportunities spread out. And indeed, we found sharp declines in the stopover to passage ratio with distance from the Gulf Coast after birds have crossed the barrier in spring, but less so in autumn before crossing. And this result suggests that birds are more likely to fall out and pile up after crossing the barrier than before crossing. Therefore, in the case of the Corn Belt, we should focus on the SPR changes at the down route boundary after birds have crossed the barrier, which is the northern boundary in spring and southern boundary in autumn. For spring migration, we don't have enough radar stations in the northern forest to assess the distance effects. In autumn, we did not find similar declining trend in the stopover to pasture ratio after birds have crossed the Corn Belt and entered the eastern forest. This suggests that the Corn Belt is a weaker barrier compared to the Gulf. However, examining SPR just within the Corn Belt, we did find notable distance effects as birds approach the finish line of barrier crossing. For easier visualization, here we plot the stopover to passage ratio of radars within the Corn Belt with distance to the down route boundary, which is the northern boundary in spring and southern boundary in autumn. And the direction of birds' movement is denoted by the arrow in each panel. So in both seasons, birds are moving closer to the down route boundary during barrier crossing. As you can see, the stopover to pasture ratio increases as birds approach the finish line of barrier crossing. This implies the tendency of birds to fly over the generally inhospitable landscapes until they have to stop due to ecological or physiological constraints. To conclude this part, we found that the Midwest Corn Belt is an anthropogenic migration barrier affecting both the flight and stopover behaviors of land birds. This confirms that large-scale land use agricultural expansion can and does create migration barriers that changes birds' behavior. When compared to the Gulf of Mexico, the Corn Belt is a weaker barrier, likely due to its narrower width and the availability of stopover sites within the Corn Belt. This highlights the necessity to protect and restore stepping stones of forest within the Corn Belt and also along the Gulf Coast because they provide the first available habitat after the prolonged trans-Gulf migration. And this will assist land birds successfully negotiate both barriers. In summary, Radar is a powerful tool to identify stopover hotspots, which is a critical missing piece in the full annual cycle conservation of migratory land birds. There are substantial seasonal differences in both hotspot distribution and habitat associations between spring and autumn migration. Most hotspots are not protected, highlighting a major conservation gap, and we are working with the USDA leadership to address this gap. Finally, we also show that large-scale land use change, such as the agricultural expansion in the Midwest, does create an anthropogenic migration barrier that changes birds' migratory behaviors. With that, I would like to thank my co-authors, my research assistants, my dissertation committee, and my funding sources. Thank you all for listening. I'll be happy to take any questions you may have. Thank you.
That was fascinating, to say the least. It would be really nice if we could zoom in on Connecticut and see where the really particular hotspots are on a local level, which is, a little hard to do on your map. But it's also interesting to see that some of these areas are already well protected. Many of our sanctuaries seem to be in the dark orange color. So that's really fascinating stuff. Also, I agree, it would be nice if we had more radar coverage for other parts of the country. Be spectacular. I had one question, a fairly simple one. When birds lift off in the evening to begin migration, they don't all go at once, right? So it's spread out over time. What is the time interval, say, from dusk till later on, when most of the birds are off their roost sites? Do we know?
Yeah, that's a great question. Let's see if I can go back to the Exodus curve here. So in general, this is like a 3-hour time span, and like as you also mentioned, we take a snapshot at the peak takeoff, at the peak exodus, basically. But birds take off in a very continuous way. So they start at around sunset. So this is like GMT time, which is probably 6 or 7 local time. And it lasts for around an hour or so. So yeah, it is a cumulative process. And so like the sampling point we take is more like taking a subsample of the birds taking off from the ground, assuming that those taking off earlier or later also from like have the same general overall pattern, spatial pattern, basically.
Oh, okay. Okay. Well, that makes sense. Great. We do have some questions. James Fisher asked, does the data indicate if birds are stopping to feed before they cross less hospitable zones?
Sorry, can you repeat that one again?
James Fisher wants to know, does the data indicate if birds are stopping to feed before they cross less hospitable zones?
Yeah, great question. Let me go back to the stopover to pasture ratio slide. So I guess like what you're asking can be partially addressed by looking at the autumn migration map, because like the northern Gulf Coast basically provides the last available stopover habitat before they initiate this long distance flight. And I don't have the scatter plot, but basically we see so this is like the trend for spring migration, where we see a very sharp decline right after crossing. We also have another plot for autumn migration, which declines with distance away from the coast, but not as sharp as spring migration. So to answer your question, yes, they tend to like pile up before crossing, but the level, like the magnitude is that less strong compared to spring migration.
Interesting. Michelle wanted to know, are there similar radar-based studies being done on other continents?
Also excellent question. So that's something I want to pursue further, and I have like colleagues working with at least Colombia and like with radar stations in Colombia and Brazil, because wherever there's weather forecast, there is weather radar station and data. So the data is already there. It's more about accessibility. And I wish like there will be more, like the field of radar aeroecology is growing with more and more people from developing countries. So I hope that together we can push forward like radar aeroecology in other countries and do similar things like this to inform local conservation efforts.
Great, excellent. Some of the questions have already been answered by your presentation.
Okay.
For instance, Tom wanted to know if we can assume there are hotspots in areas not covered by radar. I would say, of course, there are.
So for that, that's okay. I have some bonus slides. So this is another paper, also using radar to map the stopover density. And you see that, so this is different from the maps I showed earlier because there's no spatial gap. And we've done this by training like machine learning algorithms to basically take all the information available and fill in the gaps between radar stations. So we can do that for different states. And like in a way, it is reliable, but it's probably like compared to the actual data measured by radar, we need like just more ground truth.
Huh. Okay, I think that's about, there's some other questions. Debbie wanted to know, Connecticut isn't the National Weather Service, isn't the National Weather Service at Bradley usable for these studies?
I'm not sure what that is. Sorry.
Bradley is an airport in Connecticut.
Okay.
It's in Hartford.
Oh, I
So
see.
she's wanting to know, isn't the National Weather Service at Bradley usable for these studies? I don't know if Bradley has a radar for, they must have radar for weather.
Well, let's see. So this is like what we use, the next generation weather radar, NextRad, that's what we call, and there are over like 143 radar stations in the contiguous United States. And from that database, I don't see like a radar station in Connecticut. I assume there are other radar that are probably also monitoring like weather pattern and other like probably aircraft, but it's not like in the same central database. And I assume like it's probably also like formatted differently. But yes, there is potential to like you make use of some of more local radar stations.
Okay, great. And my longtime friend and colleague Sylvia Halkan asks, can you say more about the effects of differences in rates of migration between spring and fall migration? For example, males that defend breeding territories benefit from arriving early in the spring before competitors of the same species arrive, while there isn't a corresponding urgency to go south in the fall. Is that reflective in the data that you've collected?
Somewhat, I guess. Let's see if I have, well, let's use the Connecticut one as an example. So to look into the phenology is one of my ongoing project, and I should have like more data once I process like 30 years of data to really address like the phenology question. But also on the rate of migration, I think the spring and autumn comparison that we see here. So when I explained these two maps, I was saying that the increase in stopover density is due to the addition of juveniles after reproduction. And the alternative explanation could be that birds are just stopping over more frequently. Because if you think about it, like we are mapping the stopover density based on the takeoff signal. And the same bird could be detected multiple times as they move along the migration route. So if one bird, like for example, in spring migration, if they only stop 2 or 3 times, whereas in the fall they stop like more than that, that will also lead to an increase in overall stopover density. So I think in a way this addressed that question because we also think like part of the difference is driven by that. So this confirms the hypothesis that in spring, birds are more in a rush to reach their breeding habitat, like the males, whereas in the fall, they're taking their time and making use of all available stopover sites.
Oh, I see. Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
James Fisher asked again, have you integrated data collected at hotspots by birders to see the species composition?
Yes, that's also one of the projects on my to-do list to make use of the eBird data. So that's definitely something that I want to pursue further, and I don't have a definite answer yet. I like to hear about your experience in Connecticut, for example, and what are the species you see in those sanctuaries?
Sure. I'm not sure how we would convey that to you. I guess through our
Mhm.
eBird programs that we use.
Yeah.
Okay,
Mhm.
great. I don't see any other questions. If I'm missing anything, Joyce, you'll let me know, or Tom, are you still on here?
We are still on.
Have you seen anything I missed? Tom, are you still awake? Did we?
I'm more than awake. I'm fascinated. No, I haven't seen anything you missed, Miley, but thanks.
Okay, all right.
Also, thank you for taking my question.
No, that was a good one.
mm.
Great.
Okay, well then I'll turn it back over to Joyce and Tom.
Well, Freda and Miley, thank you so much. Freda, this was a really great presentation. Just makes me think. We use radar data to identify the nights of the highest migration so that we can do text alerts to people to turn their lights off. So everybody, if you have not signed up for a text alert for lights out, please do. Migration is coming. It's probably started already, right, Miley? It's started.
Yeah, not
The
only
big
that,
migration nights are starting.
not only that, we use the weather radar to see when birds are moving into Connecticut on a daily basis during migration. We can see waves of birds coming in through radar. So we know, hey, today will be a good day to get out in the field, because all these, and they can predict the numbers of birds and where they're migrating into. So we can hit those spots first thing in the morning to see what's moved. I mean, it's radar is an amazing tool, amazing tool. And Freda, thank you so much for this.
Thank
Was a
you.
wonderful presentation. I managed not to be lost in the weeds too long here, but I think I picked most of it up. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you for
Thank
inviting
you,
me.
Freda. And yeah, check out eBird. All of our sanctuary sites have hotspots on eBird, so we're collecting our data on all of the birds that are stopping over. We have some of the properties that we manage are some of the greatest hotspots for bird migration. So we're always happy to see that. You're kind of targeting information that would be relevant to our birdcraft sanctuary or Deer Pond sanctuary, or our Pomfret sanctuary. And so all of our viewers, if you haven't traveled around the state, please start traveling around, especially during migration. Watch for the month of May. We'll have Migration Magic, and we'll be doing programs all over the state. Join us, come and see some of these great locations where the birds are stopping for migration.
Please do. I'd love to spend a day in the field with you anytime.
Yeah.
Totally. Yeah.
We want to thank everybody for joining us this evening. Connecticut Audubon has a greater impact because of you, your support, your enthusiasm, you telling us what really is your biggest interest and what you are worried most about really helps guide us. Our next Young, Gifted, and Wild presentation will be on March 6th at 7 p.m. on the effects of global climate change on forest birds in Eastern Northern America, and I'm sure that will definitely relate to Freda's presentation tonight. So plan on joining us that evening as well. On behalf of everybody at Connecticut Audubon Center, thank you so much.
Thank you all again. Thanks very much. It was a great presentation.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.